Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you all are doing well and healthy. Today, me, Namira Aslanlı, and my groupmates Abdullah Kazımov, Nazrin Qismətli, Vəli Həziyev, Sibel Hamidova, İltun Hüseynli, Ahmet Hüseynov will talk about imperialism in Latin America. Here you can see paragraph from editorial Washington Post in 1898 about imperialism period and a new consciousness seems to have come upon us, the consciousness of strength, and with it a new appetite, the yearning to show our strength, ambition, interest, land, hunger, pride, the mere joy of fighting, whatever it may be, we are animated by a new sensation. We are face to face with a strange destiny. The taste of empire is in the mouths of the people, even as a taste of blood in the jungle. Imperialism is generally seen to have started in the late 1800s, while others argue that US territory expansion at the cost of Native Americans is comparable enough to merit the same label. Most Latin American states battled for their independence in the early 19th century and liberating from Spanish colonial domination. Even though the term imperialism usually refers to an empire's direct rule over a colony, there are various types of imperialism. We're going to talk about US imperialism in Latin America today. The United States of America began its political existence as a British Empire colony, but when the 20th century began, the country soon rose to become one of the world's most powerful imperial powers. And American imperialism was not a one-off occurrence, nor was it pursued only for humanitarian reasons. Imperialism, on the other hand, was a continuation of Americans' expansionist past. And many American leaders felt that economic means might be used to dominate the world's furthest reaches. Because of the United States' economic dominance, it was possible for the US to exert indirect influence over the internal affairs of other sovereign countries without resorting to colonial administration or military intervention. And if we talk about Roosevelt corollary, throughout his presidency, Theodore Roosevelt worked hard to elevate the United States to the status of an international power. The president followed a program aimed at reducing European countries' dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Historically, European countries have given money to Central and South American countries, and these governments have regularly defaulted on their debts. As a result, the Western power dispatched its armed force to capture the defaulting nation's customs house in order to collect taxes and pay off the debt. In order to strengthen American authority in the area, Roosevelt made efforts to limit European financial lending. And in 1904, as an extension to the Monroe Doctrine, the president released the Roosevelt Corollary. The corollary made it clear that European countries should avoid the Western Hemisphere. And in his declaration, Roosevelt stated that the US government would shoulder the blame for policing the region. If one of the Latin American countries defaulted on its loans, the US would step in and take over the position of collector. Roosevelt's policies limited European powers' impact and reach. Within the Western Hemisphere, the Roosevelt corollary secured American predominance. Now my groupmate Abdullah will talk about further details.
I am Abdullah Kazımov, and I will talk about policy and resistance dynamics of US imperialism in Latin America. The US has always been imperialistic in its approach to national development in Latin America. But in the wake of World War II, the situation that it found itself in commanding, it's estimated half of the world's industrial capacity and 80% of its financial resources, and already an occupying power of major proportions, awakened in US policymaking circles, and its foreign policy establishment, its historic mission regarding the Americas, and also the dream of world domination, provoking the quest to bring it about in the preferred form of an informal empire. A key strategy to this purpose was to institute the rules for what would have be termed to global governance for securing its economic and geopolitical strategic interests in a world liberated from colonial rule. Example, competing empires. The resulting world order, dubbed Bretton Woods I by some, provided an institutional framework for advancing the geopolitical strategic interests of the US in the context of a Cold War waged against the emerging power of the USSR, and for advancing cooperation for international development, a policy designed to ensure that the economically backward countries seeking to liberate themselves from the yoke of European colonialism. And this development project required to the US to assume the lead, but also share power with its major allies, strategic partners in a common enterprise organized as a OECD and a United Europe with a system of United Nations institutions to provide a multilateral response to any security threats. And that prevented any one country from embarking on the path of world domination via unilateral action. This was the price that the US had to pay for national security under conditions of an emerging threat presented by the USSR, Soviet communism, backed up by what was feared to be a growing, if not commanding, state power. And when we talk about the US imperialism's past and future, but also the present, we also should not mention the privatization of imperial wars. And there is a perfect paragraph from the Power and Resistance, US Imperialism in Latin America book, page 113. And here it's clearly explained how privatization of imperial wars was done. So the privatization of imperial wars, the vast growth and use of mercenaries contracted by the Pentagon has led to the vast pillage of tens of billions of dollars from the US Treasury. Large-scale corporations that supply mercenary military combatants have become a very influential force shaping the nature and the consequences of US empire building. Military strategists, defenders of Israeli colonial interests in the Middle East, mercenary military and intelligence corporations are central actors in the imperial state, and it's their decision-making influence which explains why US imperial wars do not result in a politically stable, economic prosperous empire. Instead, their policies have resulted in unstable, ravaged economies in perpetual rebellion. And what's next? What will be the future of US imperialism? Is it going to the way of more economic, more military? And what will the world be like? And to understand the future of US imperialism, it's important to sum up and evaluate the experience and policies of the past quarter of a century. If we compare US empire building between 1990 and 2015, it's clearly in decline economically, politically, and even militarily in most regions of the world. Through the process of decline is not linear and probably not irreversible. Despite talk in Washington of reconfiguring imperial priorities to take account of MNC economic interests, little has been accomplished. Obama's so-called pivot to Asia has resulted in new military base agreements with Japan, Australia, and the Philippines surrounding China and reflects an inability to fashion free trade agreements that exclude China. Meantime, the US has militarily restarted the war and re-entered Iraq and Afghanistan in addition to launching new wars in Syria and Ukraine. And that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, my classmates, for presenting before me. And I am Nazan Ismatli. I'm going to talk about why did America imperialize Latin America. So at the beginning of the Second World War, the United States, which was also a dominant economic power of the so-called free world, wanted to gain more power with foreign policies. Under the effect of threat from USSR and the context of Cold War and the ongoing decolonization in economically poor areas of the world made the United States decide on a foreign policy. The reason behind this policy was to advance economic and geopolitical interests of the United States as a world-dominating power, also including profits and strategic security to be defended from USSR. Mostly, United States was concerned to dominate the power and influence in Latin America and the Caribbean. United States has always been imperialistic in its approach to national development in Latin America, but upcoming World War II awakened the United States, who held half of the industrial capacity of the world and 80% of financial resources in its hands. The United States wanted to revive its dream of world domination and historic mission regarding the Americas. The new policies of American imperialism was there to make sure that new world order would provide a geopolitical strategic advantage for United States and to prevent the decolonized countries, which were initially colonized by England and France, to succumb to communism, but rather to liberate themselves and develop on a capitalist path. This system of economic imperialism maintained by United States hegemony was fully functional throughout the 80s and the reign of Ronald Reagan. But in the 90s, the Soviet Union threat disappeared, and this international communism did not last long as new imperialism emerged. This new imperialism was based on aggressive multilateralism, namely using force when and where necessary. Although the United States projected its military power in other places of imperial war, such as Colombia and Yugoslavia, the policy of imperial war and the strategy of military force were directed towards the Gulf region. In the wake of Cuban Revolution, United States directed its development and strategy efforts away from national building to developing societies, one of which was Latin America. This new strategy constructed the Alliance for Progress, which was aimed to the local poor to turn them away from the social movements against United States imperialistic approaches and to develop instead. These new strategies resulted in the defeat of social revolution among the poor in Latin America and destruction of national liberty armies that went against United States imperialism. Thank you all.
Thanks, Nazreen. I am Vali Haziev, and now I am going to talk about the struggle dynamics of community-based resistance. Prior to the 1990s, the class struggle and the popular movement in Latin America were primarily concerned with issue of social class related to struggle over land in the countryside and the labor movement for wages and working conditions in the urban centers. However, the popular movements with the agency of class-based and community-based social movements mobilized against the neoliberal state in in resistance against their policies in the 1990s. By the end of the decade, a number of these movements, led by proletarianized peasant farmers, rural landless workers, and indigenous communities, achieved major gains in their struggle in a number of contexts. With existing neoliberal regimes on the defensive and provoking a legitimation crisis for the neoliberal state. At the turn into 21st century, to all intents and purposes, neoliberalism was dead, no longer able to serve its legitimating function to neutralize the class structures. With the already observed and widely reported left turn in national politics, which is called pink tide, the regimes that came to power in the wake of widespread disenchantment with neoliberalism, each and all, including overtly neoliberal regimes in Mexico and Colombia. So to move beyond neoliberalism, at least rhetorically, in the search for a new form of governance and alternative path towards national development, a new post-neoliberal state. To put not to find a point on it, the fundamental concern shared by both the community of development associations and the social democratic center left is to bring back the state from its inner contradictions. Contradictions from failures of free market capitalism. That's all about my part. Now I'm giving floor to my group mate, Sibel Hamidova.
I, Sibel Hamidova, will speak on the Latin American social movements challenge. The new wave of social movements and electoral radicalization emerging in Latin America, which Washington so affectionately refers to as its backyard, is a current issue. I'd like to highlight a few points that demonstrate the region's rising challenge to imperialism. The importance of indigenous peoples, particularly in Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Guatemala, and Mexico, but also in nations with smaller indigenous communities, such as Chile and Argentina, to a surprising level. Indigenous peoples in the Americas are well aware that imperialism is part of a history of murderous oppression spanning more than 500 years. Indigenous peoples are acutely aware of certain fundamental realities derived from imperialism's continuation, such as the use of kidnapping, disappearances, and torture, and ecological destruction, and the creation and perpetuation of an unpayable foreign debt as a tool for dominating entire nations as they mount popular resistance. The Zapatista uprising in Mexico, for example, exemplifies the role of women and the impoverished in the upsurge of resistance and its leadership. It's also demonstrated in Argentina by the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, as well as street picketers and workers' protests, as well as self-managed factories, which were founded when employees moved into abandoned companies during the economic crisis and resumed production on their own. These elements are prevalent among the impoverished Venezuelan masses and Bolivarian circles who stood out in defense of their elected president and the new Bolivarian constitution in the face of a US-backed destabilization operation. Working women, vendors, and housewives in Bolivia, for example, have created community defense committees for a block-by-block struggle. Thousands of Nicaraguans participated in a big march in April 2004 and continue to mobilize. It illustrates the critical importance of including a patriarchy theory and conceptualizing women's triple exploitation in any meaningful examination of imperialism and the evolution of social movements. People may be able to look back and reconceptualize imperialism as not only the last stage of capitalism, but also the last stage of patriarchy, genocide, racism, and mass poverty if popular efforts eventually succeed in bringing it down. Despite new and extremely brutal waves of repression focused on peasants and trade unionists, they continue to play an important role. In many nations, such as Mexico, the peasantry has mostly evolved into a new proletariat that functions as a low-cost, flexible, and migrant labor force. Simultaneously, a process of transforming peasant laborers back into traditional peasants has begun, compelling people to return to rural and parcels in order to farm the bare necessities of subsistence. Latin America's rural areas and urban outskirts have often been a hotbed of class struggle. Workers have created new means of fighting against the owners and corrupt union officials who join with the workers' class enemies in trade union struggles. Latin American social movements scored a series of spectacular successes at the turn of the century. The people of Cochabamba, Bolivia, triumphed in their water battle in Bechtel, a transnational corporation based in the United States. On a larger scale, indigenous peoples staged a popular movement against Occidental petroleum and the complicit Ecuadorian government, which resulted in the president's removal. The Argentine rebellion of 2001 deposed 3 presidents in a row. The next year, Lula da Silva and the Brazilian Workers' Party won a landslide political victory in Brazil. Nevertheless, it can be seen that since 1994, when the Zapatistas staged an uprising in Chiapas, Mexican social movements have strongly resisted the capitulationism of Fox and his PRI predecessors.
I'm Iltun Seyri. Now I'm going to talk about the economical aspects of Latin America during the imperialism. This pre-capital character of the dominant relations of production in Latin America was not only not incompatible with the production for the world market, but was actually insatisfied by the expansion of the latter. The feudal regime of the hacienda tended to increase its service extractions on the peasantry at the growing demand of the world market simulated maximization of their surplus. So we can divide the economy of Latin America in 4 stages, and the first stage is the mercantile colonial stage, during which the region was tied to expanding European metropolis through an exploitative commercial system, ultimately based on the pre-capitalist relations of production transplanted to Latin America from Europe. The second one is the mercantile neocolonial stage, during which Latin America became radically independent of the European metropolis, but was then reconquered and more tightly integrated into expanding system of capitalism, while all the time the relations of production remained pre-capitalist. The third one is the industrial imperial stage, during which the expansion of the industrial capitalism in Europe created a series of imperatives in Latin America that led to more or less rapid transformation of the relations of production and the implementation of the capitalist class process. And the last one is, following the end of World War II, Latin America entered the 4th stage in relationship with the metropolitan powers, the monopoly imperial stage, during which the impact of monopoly capital, as Harry Baberman suggests, make it possible for the mercantile colonial stage. Then, working from a macrostructural perspective, The Despentes test argues that the European involvement in Latin America that began during 16th century was part of the initial expansion of the mercantile capitalism, an expansion that contributes enormously to the primitive accumulation which laid the basis for the development of industrial capitalism in later years. This process elaborated by Marx and summarized by Frank. So now I pass my turn to Ahmed Zeynep in order to conclude our presentation. Thanks for your attention.
Hi everyone. Today I want to talk about how did imperialism affect in Latin America. You know that capitalist imperialism is rooted in the logic of socio-economic systems that is driven by the competitive pursuit of profit based on the exploitation of labor and which is subsequently prone to over-accumulation. In this respect, it is an expression of the contradictory character of capitalist accumulation. In a context of over-accumulation, Harvey argues that if system-wide devaluations of capital and of labor power are not to follow, then ways must be found to absorb these surpluses. Capital facilitated by its respective state, whose aim is to ensure the expanded reproduction of capitalist social relations pursues a special fix to resolve the systematic crisis of over-accumulation. New geographical regions are sought to absorb the existing surpluses of capital and avoid their devaluation, while flagging profitability can be improved by accessing cheap labor and raw materials in these areas. In effect, fresh spaces of accumulation are established as capitalism penetrates new territories, creating a world of their own image, or as all the colonial spaces are radically transformed in the interests of a new accumulation strategy. But the creation of new spaces of accumulation is not an innocuous process. It's inevitably involves the forceful and violent reorganization of people's lives as they are subordinated to whims of capital, corresponding to emergence of structural adjustment as a strategy for regaining access to economies of the South. Furthermore, free trade agreements, which are also aimed at codifying neoliberalism and investment rights of capital from North in developing nations. Besides its free trade agreements with the US and Mexico, Canada has agreements with Chile, Costa Rica, and Israel. Canada has also been the most aggressive proponent of the free trade area of the Americas and has pursued sub-regional deals with Mercosur and Andean countries. Canada has also signed foreign investment protection agreements with nearly 2,000 countries since 1994, most of which are in the South and 8 of which are in Latin America. All of these are the results of imperialism in Latin America. Latin America and the Caribbean are home to 25% of the world's forests and 40% of the biodiversity. The region contains just short of a third of the globe's reserves of copper, bauxite, and silver. 24% of oil, 8% of natural gas, and 5% of uranium. The transfer from state property to transnational capital of this and other natural resources has been a fundamental component of the transition to neoliberalism in the 1980s and 1990s. Such natural endowments have long constituted an important part of the region's geopolitical importance, with the colonial race for mining exploration and extraction in particular standing out as a predominant thematic of imperialism in Latin America and the Caribbean. The pace has only intensified under neoliberal capitalism. Most new areas of mining investment in Latin America are on inhabited land, and even when these areas are not directly inhabited, communities nearby are commonly affected by the inevitable environmental of mining, which include industrial runoff affecting local water sources or the destabilization of the migratory and the mating patterns of the game and the lost arable land resulting. From the infrastructure development accompany meaning. Thus meaning investment and resistance to it is an increasing source of conflict in Latin America between poor and indigenous communities on the one hand and typically foreign winning corporations on the other hand. We see that imperialism in Latin America leads to good and bad results, but since imperialism is really of our age, Latin America had to accept it. Thanks for listening, and I